Good evening. Good to see you tonight. As I sat down on this soft cushion in this air-conditioned building, I had a flashback to when I was a little kid. Had the hard church pews, had the funeral home fans, opened the windows. There was no air conditioning. That was BAC, before air conditioning, That's the good old days. We talk about the good old days. That's the good old days. Then I had another remembrance shortly after that when my kids were little. Fast forward to when I was a young adult and married and had 4 kids, because they were ages about 2 to 7 at the time. And one time we were sitting, this is before children's church, and so we were sitting listening to the preacher. And so I was here and wife's here, and the 4 kids just kind of stair-stepped down, and we're in the middle of the sermon. And unbeknownst to us, the 2-year-old had climbed down from his seat and had crawled under about 5 pews, popped his head up, and he was looking back at us, waving at us. What do you do then? Anyway, good memories, good memories. Anyway, we've been studying the book of Nehemiah. This is our second lesson in Nehemiah. As we've said before, we are sort of, as Pastor is bringing to us lessons in Genesis on alternate Wednesday nights, which is the beginning of the Old Testament history. We've been doing Ezra, and then we did Esther, now Nehemiah. This is the 3 books that kind of tell us the history of the end of the Old Testament before the 400 years where God is silent before the time of Jesus. So a quick review of chapter 1 in case you weren't here with us last time 2 weeks ago. The year is 446 BC, so about 446 years before Christ. The place is Susa, which is the capital of the world empire of Persia. The king is Artaxerxes. He is the son of Xerxes and Queen Esther. So as the book opens, Nehemiah is a Jew. They're one of the Jews that has not gone back to the promised land. And he is a cupbearer to the king. So he's a trusted servant. He's not a rich man. He works for the king. He's a cupbearer. And what that means is, back in those days, the most popular way of assassinating a king was not through warfare, but was through poisoning. So you'd pay off somebody that could get close to him, and then you would poison his drink, and then he would die. And so all the kings knew that, so they had cupbearers who would taste everything before it went into the king's mouth. So if somebody died, it was going to be the cupbearer, not the king. So that's who Nehemiah is. So as chapter 1 opens, his brother named Hananiah comes back from Jerusalem. So we assume that Hananiah had gone 12 years earlier to the promised land when Ezra took a group. We read about that when we studied the book of Ezra. And so we assume that he went then and has now come back, and he comes to Nehemiah, and he returns with bad news. He says that the exiles who have survived the trip and who have survived living there are in great trouble and shame, and the walls of Jerusalem are still down. So the rest of chapter 1 was a great prayer that Nehemiah prayed. As he fasts, he mourns, he weeps, and he prays for days for God's people in Jerusalem. So we knew from our study of Ezra that the temple had been completed when the first group went back about 69 years before this. That was in Ezra chapter 6. But the walls and the gates were still down. Nebuchadnezzar, when he overran Jerusalem years and years ago before the 70-year captivity, had not only destroyed Solomon's temple, but he also destroyed all the gates and the walls. And so the culture back then, the pagan culture, the belief of the cultural people there was that a city without walls was a disgrace to the people, and a temple without walls protecting it was a shame to the God of that temple. And so this is why Hananiah comes back and talks to Nehemiah and says they're living in great trouble and shame and disgrace. And so please, can you do something about this? And I think Hananiah knew that Nehemiah was close to the king, obviously as a cupbearer. So even though Nehemiah himself was not a man of means, he was hoping that Nehemiah would somehow influence the king to get this job done. So Nehemiah's been praying to God for help, for guidance, for wisdom about rebuilding the walls. But he knows in his heart this is above his pay grade. This is something he can't do on his own. He will need the help of the king. It's a massive project. And so in the very last verse of chapter 1, he says, God grant me today mercy in the sight of this man, meaning the king Artaxerxes. Then he waits for God's timing. So the title of the lesson tonight is Pray, Wait, and Plan. And this is a great example for us as we go through our Christian life. So even though he prays, today I want this done, God. That's kind of like our prayers. We see a need and we want God to, we want to push the button and God to act. But we learn from the first verse of chapter 2 tonight when God actually started working. So let's read verse 1 of chapter 2. All the verses are on your lesson sheets. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine, this is Nehemiah speaking, and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. So we know from verse 1 of chapter 1, it was the Jewish month of Chislev, which is our December. And here we have the month of Nisan, which is our month of April. That's 4 months. So Nehemiah has waited 4 months for God to act. So we ask our question, why did he wait 4 months? It's not because he had a lack of opportunity. He was probably serving the king almost every day. I mean, we don't know how many cupbearers the king had, but certainly, you were expected to work most days, I would think. And so it's not that he was not before the king, but I believe that he was waiting for God to reveal to him the right time to act and also what to say. And we'll kind of see that as we go through that. So I have no doubt he continued praying as he patiently waited. But I also believe during those times, while he's waiting for God to move, I believe that he probably, we have no reason to think he had ever been to Jerusalem. So we're talking about him leading a group to rebuild walls of a place he's never been to. And it's not really a small place. It's a pretty good sized town. And so I believe that he was probably also talking to other Jews who had come back and trying to get the lay of the land, get an idea of how big this project was and what was needed and what kind of materials were available. So I believe besides praying and waiting, I believe he was planning from day one. So at this time, we notice that Nehemiah's heart is very troubled. And before this, he says, I haven't ever looked sad before this day. So I think it just had come upon him. And maybe God said, this is the time to work, and so I'm going to work, and so maybe it's time to kind of show on your face that you're not real happy about the situation. Anyway, so let's see what happens, verse 2 and 3. So the king asked me, why does your face look so sad? And when you're not ill, this can be nothing but sadness of heart. I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? So King Artaxerxes is very astute. I mean, he knows the history of kings. And so he knows about, how kings get poisoned. And he knows that, the cupbearers are chosen because of their integrity and their loyalty to the king. But also he knows that other kings have had cupbearers who have been paid off. And so, Artaxerxes for the first time sees Nehemiah not real happy, and he says, okay, now why are you not happy? He's thinking maybe Nehemiah's been bribed and been paid off, but he's sad that he's having to do this. It's kind of like Judas giving back the 30 pieces of silver. He has remorse because, he really liked Jesus, but he liked the money more. And so, I think Artaxerxes is pretty astute thinking, okay, and that's why Nehemiah says, I was very much afraid because he's, the king's saying, okay, what's going on here now? You're different. I can see a difference in your face. Anyway, so the king says, Nehemiah, I can see you're sad but not sick, so what's the matter? So 4 months of waiting, what happens? God opens the door. God opens the door. He's been waiting for 4 months. He's been planning. He's been praying. And finally, the king says, what's going on, Nehemiah? Tell me what's in your heart. So what do we do when God opens the door? If we've been praying, we've been planning, we've been waiting, then all of a sudden the door opens, That's not the time to hesitate. That's not the time to question it. That's not the time to think about it. That's the time to step through the door. And that's exactly what we see Nehemiah doing. So he tells the king what's bothering him. He says, the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins, and the gates have been destroyed by fire. Now, we're going to talk more about that phrase, where my ancestors are buried, in just a second, and kind of give you an idea of why he said that. Okay, verse 4. The king said to me, what is it you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven. I love this verse. Okay, so he's before the king, and the king says, okay, so that's the situation. What do you want? And so Nehemiah says, I prayed. So this is not like, king, excuse me, I'm going to go in my prayer closet and pray a while. I'll come back and answer your question. No, this is one of those, you can call it an instant prayer or an arrow prayer, or, nowadays it might be, texting, God, what up, put the words in my mouth, God. Other words, okay, God, here it is. This is the door. The door's wide open. The king says, what do you want? I've been praying about this for 4 months. I've been waiting on it. I've been planning for 4 months. Make sure I say the right things. So, guide my words, God. So verse 5, and I answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried, so I can rebuild it. So I believe God gave him wisdom on what to say. Now, think about Nehemiah's situation. He's been a cupbearer, so he's been in the presence of the king. We don't know how long. We assume for maybe some years, because he's a trusted servant. So he hears a lot. So, we're not talking about just meals, but do you ever get thirsty during the day and want to drink during the day? So he's got to be there all the time. So he hears all the goings on in the court. He knows the business. He knows the thinking of the king. And he knows the business that goes on. He knows what concerns the king and what projects the king has going on. And so, if you remember back when we studied the Sermon on the Mount 2 or 3 years ago, that's where I really came to understand. For years I'd been taught, and I believe that when you interpret the Bible, there's kind of 2 big C's, consistency and context. And when we did the Sermon on the Mount, and I was kind of doing some deeper study, I found that you need to add a 3rd C, and that's culture. Because if you can add, we're a different culture than those folks back then, thousands of years ago, halfway around the world. We live differently. We think differently. Even the folks that live over there right now think differently than we do. That's why we can't seem to get together. Anyway, and so I think I mentioned during this Ezra, Esther, Nehemiah study, I've been kind of doing some background study on the Persian kings, because I wanted to kind of get into their head a little bit, because, throughout Ezra and Esther and Nehemiah, we're talking about Jews interacting with these great Persian kings. And so I want to do a little detour here and kind of give you some background and tell you why I believe that he brings up this, where my ancestors are buried. Because you go back to chapter 1, there's not a word said about that. Hananiah does not bring that up. That's not a concern of Hananiah. When you look at Nehemiah's prayer, that's not a concern. But for some reason, God tells Nehemiah that's a concern that the king has, that these kings are concerned about where their ancestors are buried and how they're buried and all that. So I think you'll find this story interesting. So we've mentioned how Persia kind of grew into about 127 provinces, all the way from Ethiopia to India up to modern-day Turkey. And so Egypt became a province of Egypt. Egypt became a province of Persia under the 2nd king, the king after Cyrus. So if you look down there on your lesson sheet, Cyrus, great King Cyrus, was the king during Ezra 1, and he's the one that allowed the first group to go back to Judah. And when we studied that, we talked about how Josephus, a Jewish historian, records that Daniel, an old man at that time who was a advisor to so many of the Babylonian and the Persian kings, had actually, as soon as Cyrus got on the throne, shown him from Isaiah and Jeremiah how hundreds of years before Cyrus was even born, God named him by name to let the people go back. And so Cyrus was the first king. After he died, his oldest son Cambyses. Now, he's not mentioned in the Bible. He's not mentioned in Ezra, Nehemiah, or Esther, because he only reigned for 8 years. He actually injured himself. There's two different stories. One is that he was carving some wood and cut himself on the leg with a knife. Another one is that he was riding a horse and his sword got tangled up and actually cut himself, but he died of gangrene of the leg, and he'd only been a king for 8 years. So there's not a lot of history about him, but one of the great things during his reign was that he was the Persian king that made Egypt one of the provinces of Persia. And so we'd mentioned before how Cyrus was so successful. You know, the Assyrians who captured the northern king, 10 tribes were just absolute barbarians. They were just some of the worst people in the world when you read about them. Then the Babylonians that Nebuchadnezzar led, who got the 2 southern tribes who are now in captivity, they were a little bit better. But the Persians kind of they're kind of the nice guys. And it all started with Cyrus. And we mentioned how he used what we call strong-arm diplomacy to expand his kingdom. He had this massive army. So he'd go up to this small country that was bordering Persia and just have a sit-down with the king. And he'd say, okay, I'm King Cyrus, and I'm here to take you in as one of our provinces. And so you have 2 choices, door number 1 or door number 2. And door number 1 is, basically, you become a province of Persia. You start paying taxes. Some of your men come into our army, and you're part of Persia. But you still get to be the king. I'll call you a satrap. But still, you keep ruling. Life goes on just like it is. Or if you don't like that door, you can choose door number 2. Look over my shoulder, look at my army. We're just going to massacre you, and you'll still be our province. So almost all of the provinces took door number 1. Right? And so he was kind of known as a diplomatic king, and so he was the first king of kings because he was the great king and had all these little kings under him. And as you know, Jesus came to be known as the King of Kings, and I think 2 Timothy and Revelation. But that's where it all started, was back with the Persian king, the king over all other kings. And so that was Cyrus, and so his son Cambyses became the emperor. And so he'd conquered some provinces with this strong-arm diplomacy, but he goes to Egypt. Egypt is having none of this. You know, Egypt has been a country for 2,000 years. They've had all these pharaohs, great culture, great literature, great wisdom, worldly wisdom, but still great worldly wisdom. So he goes and he sits down, and that pharaoh says, no. You're having to bring your army, almost 1,000 miles, so you've got a tremendous supply chain that you're going to have to use to feed and quartermaster your troops. You're going to fight on our land. We've got a great army. We've been, sovereign for 2,000 years. So we choose door number 2. So Cambyses goes back to his advisors and says, this is not a good thing because we might lose this one. So what can we do to win this war? And so they start thinking about how the Egyptians think. And so this is the first example we know of in ancient history of psychological warfare. And so the advisors tell him that the Egyptians worship a lot of different animals, but the cat is the most sacred animal to the Egyptians. The house cat, what we call a house cat. And that it is so sacred to Egyptians that anybody that kills a cat is sentenced to death. I mean, that's how serious that is. I think my wife, Kathy, has some Egyptian blood in her. I've threatened to kill our cat, and I just kind of get the look. Anyway, so what Cambyses and his generals do is they round up thousands of cats and put them in sacks. And the soldiers, especially the ones on the front line, as they go into war, it's the Battle of Pelusium, 525 BC. As they get to the Egyptian front lines, they pull the cats out of the bag and they hold the cats up. And the Egyptians are absolutely dumbstruck because they can't kill a cat. Isn't that a crazy story? I told Keith before, I said, you're going to hear the craziest story in the world. Okay, can you put the picture up, Bandy? Okay, this is a 1860 historical artist painting of this war. And so they're the Persians, and they're fighting at Pelusium, and those are cats flying up in the air, but now I think he's got a cat in it. He showed him in a crate. The historians say it was sacks. He's got a cat in his hand right there. So the Battle of Pelusium. So basically, the Egyptians lose 50,000 men. The Persians lose just a handful. And they overcome the Egyptians. And Egypt is now Cambyses is the new pharaoh of Egypt. And Egypt is a province of Persia. Now, how that leads us, you say, what in the world does this have to do with our story tonight? Okay, so we're getting there. So Cambyses and all the other Persian rulers that after him are so impressed with what the Egyptian pharaohs did with their burials, their tombs, their pyramids, that when Cambyses goes back and all the others after him go back, they want to be memorialized just like the Egyptians did. They developed this fascination with tombs and the burial of themselves and the burial of their ancestors. So, okay, do the next picture. Let's see here. Oh, so the saying, let the cat out of the bag, that's where it came from. And so what let the cat out of the bag means to reveal a fact or a twist in the plot that was previously hidden. Okay, so, this is, I have it on the bottom of your lesson sheet, Nosh-e-Rustam. This is some people have called it the Mount Rushmore of ancient Persia. It's in present-day Iran. This is, if you can see these carved tombs, there's actually 4, I think there's supposed to be 4. I see 1, 2, 3, and I think the 4th one's around the corner. There's a close-up. So if you look on your lesson sheet, you see Cambyses. You know, he died young, and so his tomb never really got finished. But Darius I, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, and Darius II, and you see those are some of the first 3 are the ones we've studied. Darius I was in Ezra 6. That's when the temple was rebuilt in Jerusalem. Xerxes was Queen Esther's husband. Artaxerxes is the king that we're talking about right now tonight. And then the next king, Darius II, who happens after Old Testament biblical history. That was their 4 tombs. And so they're massive tombs that go way back into the mountain, and they were very elaborate like the Egyptian pharaohs. Now, unfortunately, like many of the pyramids, they've been looted over the centuries. But that place still stands and is still revered in Iranian and Persian history. Okay, so back to our story. So twice here, Nehemiah says, I want to go back and rebuild the walls where my ancestors are buried, basically saying my ancestor burial places are not protected. And so I believe that God put those words in his mouth because he knew that the Persian king was very concerned about those types of things. And that kind of goes back to a verse that we've used, I think, almost every lesson in Ezra, Esther, and Nehemiah about Proverbs 21:1, that the king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. That God knows how to move the heart of a king. And I think this is one of the ways that he did it in our lesson tonight. Okay, verse 6. The king, beside whom the queen was sitting, asked me, how long will your journey take? And when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me, and I gave him a definitive time for my return. That's the Amplified Version. And so we don't know why Nehemiah mentions the queen. We do know that Queen Esther was the king's mother, but she had been made queen about 30 years earlier. And we've mentioned how short lifespans for most people were back then. So we don't know if she's still alive at this point or not. But maybe Artaxerxes' wife liked Nehemiah, and she was kind of whispering to him, do whatever he wants to or something like that. We don't know. But the king does say how long you can be gone. And that obviously, he wants to know when he's coming back. So obviously Nehemiah was doing a good job, and he was liked. You know, if you have an employee and the employee asks for a leave of absence, and you say come back, it means you like them, they're doing a good job. It said don't bother coming back means, you know, you're not doing such a hot job. Anyway, so it says Nehemiah says, I gave him a definite time. So this is interesting. So Nehemiah's never been to Jerusalem. Because of this 4 months of planning and talking to people who've been there and doing his research, he knew approximately a pretty close time when he would be gone. Planning. So while he's waiting, while he's praying, he is planning. So he knew about what he needed. He knew materials. He knew labor. He knew how much. And so he knew how long he'd be gone. So the point here is that walking by faith doesn't mean we shouldn't make plans. You know, I believe that God honors planning and organization when it's done by faith. You know, you can't, you know, when Ray Hope built this building here, we didn't just sit down at the old 2nd Street Church and pray about it. There had to be a lot of planning put into it, a lot of waiting, praying, planning, and waiting. So it's not against God's way to plan and wait, and certainly not to pray. Verse 7 and 8. I said also to him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. And may I have a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the royal park, so he'll give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy. And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my request. So again, we see that Nehemiah has planned and thought through everything he needs for the journey and for the rebuilding. He needed letters from the king to ensure safe passage, even though he was still going to be going within Persia. Obviously, there were, you know, robbers along the road, and things could happen. As we mentioned before, it's like a 4-month journey. It'd be like walking from here to Chicago. So he needed safe passage, but also he needed, once he got there, he needed letters to the keeper of the king's forest that he could get all the timber that he needed for the rebuilding project. And notice, he keeps saying this just like Ezra. Remember when we studied the book of Ezra? Ezra keeps saying the hand of God. The hand of God is on me. The hand of God is on the king. The hand of God is on us. He just said, I think in 2 chapters he said it 6 times. And we talked about how that's like, we liken to God being the chess master and us being the pieces and us yielding to his will, and each person being a different position in the kingdom and playing a different part. But yielding to God, he moves, his hand moves us. We let his hand move us to work in his kingdom. And so I believe Nehemiah, you know, before Ezra left 12 years earlier, I believe Nehemiah probably sat at Ezra's feet and learned a lot, because he mentions this hand of God several times in this book. So he understands that concept also. Verse 9, so I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king also had sent army officers and cavalry with me. So even though the king just didn't only just give him the letters, he sent a military escort with him. So the king knew he needed to be kept safe for this journey. Verse 10, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite officials heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. So these guys were from groups that hated the Jews. So he's on his way, at this point, he's still on his way to Jerusalem. And here we have the first hint of opposition. And if you've studied Nehemiah before, you know this is a big part of this story, is the opposition that they have to overcome. And so news of Nehemiah and his company's journey and their intentions arouses opposition from those who hate the Jews. So Sanballat is a Persian government official in Samaria. Samaria is just above Judea. And then Tobiah is a Persian government official in Ammon, which is the area just across the Jordan River from Judea. And so they both have vested interest in keeping power in those areas. So they had probably figured out from the letters that Nehemiah had exactly what his plans were. Verse 11 through 16. I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. I had not, I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. By night I went out through the valley gate toward the Jackal Wall and the Dung Gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on toward the Fountain Gate and the King's Pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through. So I went up through the valley by night, examining the wall. Okay, go to the back side of your lesson sheet. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I'd gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or the nobles or the officials or any others who would be doing the work. So here Nehemiah changes hats. He's no longer the cupbearer. Now he is a construction engineer. He's a project supervisor. And like I said, we have no reason to know that he's ever been there. So he's having to survey this project that he's been planning from afar. So before he ever meets with any of the leaders in Jerusalem, it says he spends 3 days. I'm sure he's praying, he's waiting. And I think he probably brings some tradesmen with him from Susa, some Jewish tradesmen, probably some stonemasons, some carpenters. And he just has a handful of people with him, and they go out and survey the city and the gates and to kind of see what this is going to be all about before they ever talk to the leaders there in Jerusalem. So they're kind of developing a master plan. Okay, verse 17 and 18. Then I said to them, you see the trouble. So he's talking to the leaders now. So after he surveys, he's talking to the Jewish leaders. You see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God, there it is again, on me, and what the king had said to me. They replied, let us start rebuilding, so they began this good work. And so, once he's developed the plan, he meets with the leaders, and notice he doesn't say, you have a problem. You know, Nehemiah's never been there before, but now he says, I'm one of us. This is a we problem, this is not a you problem. And so notice he uses that we, us, we. I mean, he's talking about, we're in this together. We're in this together. And just because I haven't been here doesn't mean I'm not part of this. And so he appeals to their emotions, to their heartfelt emotions, that if we do this, we will no longer be under derision and disgrace. Okay, verse 19 to 20. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite officials, and Geshem the Arab, see, they recruited the third guy, heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you're doing? They asked, are you rebelling against the king? I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We are his servants, and we're going to start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or any historic right to it. So Sanballat and Tobiah recruit a new ally, Geshem, and once again they're running their mouths off. They're criticizing. They're trying to discourage Nehemiah and the Jews. But he replies with determination, God's hand is on us. You have no right. You might as well just get lost. Okay, let's look at the lessons from this tonight from chapter 2. Number 1, praying and waiting go hand in hand. We live in such an impatient world. Think about microwave meals, urgent med, fast food, express traffic lanes, faster speed limits. It's never fast enough. You think about the speed of your computer 20 years ago, now it's, maybe 100 times faster. But that's not fast enough. We're going to get faster. We're just never real happy. I was thinking back to back when each one of my kids turned 18, I told them I'd take them on a trip, just me and them. So my youngest son, Joshua, who now lives in Chicago, he said, I want to go camping at Yellowstone. So, well, we were going to fly up there, so you couldn't really take camping equipment, didn't have any camping equipment. So this is the early days of the internet, so I actually found some old hunters' cabins that were just outside the park. They were 1920s hunters' cabins, so primitive camping, I guess you say. So they're little log cabins made for a couple of hunters. And in each cabin, there was an old spring bed. There was like a little dormitory refrigerator. There was a single light bulb. And they had this nice white porcelain stove. And it kind of looked kind of modern for the cabin. I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. So I started looking. I didn't see an electric wire to it. I didn't see a gas line. And sure enough, it's white porcelain, had the burners, but there was a wood box underneath it. So it was a wood-burning stove. And then I noticed the brand name of the stove, Quick Meal. So 100 years ago, a quick meal was when you went out and chopped the wood, put the wood on the stove, lit the fire, waited for it to get hot, and put your meal on the top. Interesting, huh? I kind of Googled that the other day to kind of see where Quick Meal. Anyway, Quick Meal was actually a big stove manufacturer from the 1890s to about the 1920s. All these different models of enameled wood stoves. And now it is the Magic Chef Corporation. Anyway, so, but my point is that faith demands waiting, and we're not good at that. We're not naturally good at waiting. And the world we live in just makes it worse because everything about us is just hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. And we don't want to wait on anybody or anything, and much less we don't want to wait on God. But look at Isaiah 40:31. They're on your lesson sheet. They who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. So Isaiah is saying, okay, if you want to renew your strength, if you want to mount up with wings like eagles, if you want to run and not be weary, if you want to walk and not be faint, you have to do one thing. You have to wait on the Lord. Wait on the Lord. So we studied how Nehemiah prayed, today, God, move the heart of the king. 4 months later, God did it. And I think it's because God knew that Nehemiah needed to pray more. He needed to wait more. He needed to plan more. You know, because if he'd gone to the king in that very first day, the king said yes, there'd been no planning. You know, he hadn't had time to talk to folks. In other words, been behind the eight ball on that project. God has a timing that we don't understand sometimes. And we've just got to wait on him. And so praying with faith demands that we give up our solutions and our timeline and let God take charge of the situation. Okay, number 2, faith is not a substitute for planning. So Nehemiah was praying and planning while he was waiting. And then when he arrived in Jerusalem, he made even more plans. He kind of finalized the plans. I had down here, and I studied this lesson before Sunday, but I know Sunday morning, Pastor used this verse. Sunday night, Tanner used this verse, and the verse is John 16:33, where Jesus said, in this world, you're going to have trouble. In this world, you're going to have tribulation. And so, you know, we face a lot of problems, and we pray about those problems, you know, family problems, financial problems, legal problems, job problems. And we pray, you know, God, fix my problem, you know, but our job is not to pray, God, fix my problem. I'm going to sit over here and watch TV and wait on you to do it. You know, I'm going to sit over here and have a pity party, God, while you're trying to, because I want you to fix my problem. I'm not going to do anything. So we need to pray, God, you know, guide my thoughts, guide my words, guide my feelings, work in my heart and the hearts of those who are against me. Help me make the best plans, help me deal with the problem, because we're part of this. God's in us, working through us. And so our actions, our words need to be what God wants us to do. So we just can't sit in a corner and pout and expect God to fix everything. Number 3, expect opposition when you do God's will. Again, John 16:33, you will have trouble on this earth. And that's just, if you're doing God's will, you're going to have some opposition because the enemy doesn't like you doing God's will. So just like Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem were a threat to Nehemiah, Jesus was a threat to the Pharisees, and anybody doing God's will on this earth today is a threat to the enemy. He doesn't like you representing Jesus on this earth. The good thing about being in America is that the opposition we face is primarily verbal. Now, if you lived in a Muslim country, your opposition would not be verbal. It would be very physical. So in a way, we're very blessed. So all we have to do is overcome the criticism, the opposition that is given to us verbally. But the reason it's given to us because it works so often. So many people are discouraged when they're criticized. It's so easy to lose your motivation when one person criticizes you. Maybe 90 people think you're doing a great job. One person criticizes you, you kind of burst your balloon. And so the enemy knows that words can kill a lot of good projects. Words can make a lot of disciples kind of cower down because it works. And so in chapter 2:14 it says, Sanballat and Tobiah mocked and ridiculed us, and Nehemiah answered. He said, God, the God of heaven, will give us success, and you have no right in this. So what we need to learn from that is, number one, expect criticism. If you're doing the will of God, expect to be criticized. Don't be surprised when you're criticized. On the other hand, if you're not being criticized at all or anything you ever do, you need to kind of look at your walk. Maybe you look too much like the world, so the enemy doesn't even recognize you as a disciple. And then the two things is, number one, be ready to handle criticism when it comes. In other words, have a ready answer. Here's a couple of ready answers you can have for criticism. I live to please God, not you. I'm not here to make you happy. I'm here to, God's my judge. God's my judge, you're not my judge. So basically you're telling the criticizer, you live by a different standard. This, you're not going by the standards that he is criticizing you by, that he says you should be following. You live by a different standard, and so he cannot expect you to live by the standard that he wants you to. And you just got to stand up to it. That's what Jesus did. Number two, know that the criticizers won't go away. And we'll see this as we go throughout Nehemiah. This Sanballat and Tobiah, these guys are persistent. Just because you stand up to a criticizer that criticizes your walk, don't expect one episode of where you stand up to them for them to totally go away. If they don't come back, somebody else will. The enemy is not going to leave you alone if you're standing up for Jesus Christ. As long as you live on this earth, if you stand up for him, he's sending somebody to try to discourage you and make you ineffective in being a disciple. So know that it's coming, be ready for an answer, and know that it's going to come back again. Anyway, so that's chapter 2 of Nehemiah. Hope you enjoyed that, and don't let the cat out of the bag.